Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to Brown Bag History. Welcome back for our 2022. And as it said in my email that this is actually the 19th season of Brown Bag History. It's kind of hard to believe. We've done over 340 talks in that time. And I will admit I have done some repeats. And this one is a repeat, but I've tried to find a little bit new information that I hadn't done the first time I did it, which was about 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, so as we start, we acknowledge the land traditions and culture of 4 nations, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance, or Sioux. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these 4 nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So, talking about the Depression, and I apologize for not sure what I was thinking, talking about the Depression in January of 2022 as we cope with another year of the pandemic. Everybody is already depressed enough, but as somebody said, maybe it'll make us look back and say, well, they had it worse than we did. But anyway, of course, the whole issue of poverty and transience existed long before the Great Depression started in 1929. There was always people riding the rails. These we have 3 photographs that were taken of what was called the Hobo jungle east of Revelstoke in 1919 by Emma Roberts. So this was 10 years before the Depression. But there was always people riding the rails, and there was always people who were transient. And they actually had what they called the Hobo jungle. And there's actually quite a few people in this photograph. Somebody's got their laundry hung out on the line, and they've got a little cooking area there and sort of set up camp. So this was basically a homeless camp. And another picture showing their little cooking area and some of the pots and pans hanging up there. There was a couple of little rough shelters in there. And of course, there was poverty in the community as well. There were families who didn't have a lot of means, especially families, single mothers whose husbands had died or left, as happened as well. In March of 1926, the city produced a bylaw called their Procedure Bylaw 328, which was passed to regulate the procedure of destitute persons applying to the Corporation of the City of Revelstoke for relief. And of course, there was no provincial welfare system at that time. There were really no social safety nets. It often fell on the churches to help out individuals who were having a hard time, or other community groups. But the city actually created a policy for relief. And the bylaw declared that in order to apply for relief from the city, the applicant must be destitute or possessed of insufficient means to obtain the necessaries of life, and unable to maintain himself or herself by reason of chronic illness or continuing physical inability, and not legally entitled to be maintained by any other person who is able to maintain him or her, or from any other source whatsoever. So that's people who really had no resources at all. The city had created a bylaw to deal with that. So when the Depression finally did hit with the stock market crash of October 29th, 1929, it did create a global depression, and the effects quickly reached Canada. By 1930, 30% of the labor force was out of work, and 1/5 of the population became dependent on government assistance. Wages fell, as did prices. Further damage was the reduction of investment. Both large companies and individuals were unwilling and unable to invest in new ventures. So the local newspaper, which definitely had a local focus, so didn't always have a lot of world news, but it actually never mentioned the US stock market crash. But there was editorial in November 20th, 1929, that said, well, one does not care to make pessimistic references to conditions here and elsewhere. It is evident enough that Christmas cheer funds will require to be a bit larger than for some years past. Revelstoke, we may confidently expect, will do its share. So Revelstoke had always had, for years previously, had a Christmas cheer campaign, and it was always organized by the Doki Lodge, which was a branch of the Knights of Pythias. And so in December of 1929, it announced that they were pleased with the response that had met their appeal. They'd received, by that point, by the middle of December, they'd received over $600 in cash donations, but they said that they would need to double that in order to meet the needs. They said they'd received a large list of needy families, and it said that an investigation had shown that these families were absolutely up against it. So they did a report of their fundraising in January 1930, and it said that in total they'd collected $1,022.88 in cash, as well as about $500 in goods. And that was up over $400 over the previous year. They distributed 58 hampers, which helped 90 adults and 96 children. They also distributed 12 loads of coal for heating in homes. In that same issue, there was an article reprinted from the Financial Post. It was a satirical post. It was talking about new games, party games that had been invented, and they were all related to the stock market. One was called Inflated Values, and they'd create two teams of the Bulls and the Bears. And another one was, they called it Skinning the Cat, where people were ripping the clothes off of each other's backs. So it was a satirical post, but it was kind of reflecting the mood of the times, and sort of that whole recognition that the whole economic system, the whole stock market system had, really not been helpful to anybody. There was also a note in the paper in April, end of April 1930, from a local businessman who had returned from Vancouver, and they'd claimed that signs in Vancouver were directing the unemployed people to Revelstoke with information that work was available on the Big Bend Road. The article went on to say, the city is full of unemployed seeking work on the road, and whether they are directed or not, they arrive daily in fair numbers. And they also believed that there was enough work for the local men without encouraging other people to come here. So there wasn't a lot of news about in 1930 about the Depression. I think it was really just starting to have effects throughout. They had started work on the Big Bend Highway, and they were just hiring men as needed at that point. With the Big Bend Highway, which of course was the highway that went from Golden to Revelstoke following the bend of the Columbia River. They started construction on that in 1929 and didn't finish it till 1940. But it was, the work was supposed to be, the expenditures were supposed to be shared between the federal and the provincial governments. And, we'll see as we go on how that played out. And so by December 31st of 1930, it mentioned that the 1930 Christmas Cheer Fund shattered records. They received $1,356, and 66 homes received hampers, comprising 111 children and 66 adults, as well as deliveries of 14.5 loads of coal and 2.5 cords of wood. And again, it was organized by the Dokis. This is a photograph that came in from Ken's family, the English family, and just it's one of the few photographs I have of sort of winter of that in that area, and this would have been about 1930. The newspaper by 1931, that's by the spring of 1931, that's when the issue of transients sort of really became chronic in the town. Just to go back, there was a note from the editorial of the last issue of December 1930, and it was titled "Good Riddance." There will be very few tear-stained faces this year when the time comes to say goodbye to 1930. If the nations of the world face 1931 with feelings of trepidation, there is little wonder. Canada has its wheat problem, the United States a grave matter of unemployment, Great Britain a complexity of critical affairs, and so the story goes. In the meantime, 1931 assumes the reins of office. In response to the popular cry, it is time for a change, and indeed it is. But unfortunately, 1931 was actually worse than 1930 in terms of the unemployment problems and the transient problems. There was an article from in May 22nd, 1931, an alderman from Kamloops had noticed 300 men beating their way on one freight train going across the country. And it also mentioned that trains pulling out of Revelstoke, both from the east and the west, continued to bring in large numbers on a daily basis. There was a letter that a man wrote to the newspaper on May 16th, 1931. And I'm going to read it all because it's quite telling about sort of the individual struggle that people were facing. His name was Henry Palmer, P-O-H-M-E-R. Dear sir, may I trespass on your valuable space to let my fellow man know conditions he has to endure in order to live? I have been in Revelstoke 3 years, done nothing since laid off the work in the Bend beginning of October. Still, I have not had to bum a meal and owe no one a cent. Got no relief work all winter, went to work on the CPR steel gang, 10 hours per day, 30 cents an hour. Got 10 days in, 2 Sundays, paid board, and I am strong and willing, but my hands were soft, and in spite of leather mitts, they were cut to the bone with the steel and blistered till I could not hold a tool and had to quit. My wages came to $30, board off $11.16, $5 poll tax, $3 other taxes, a total deductive of $19.16, and had $10.84 left. Stranded at field, no passes were issued to take me back home, and along with others, was herded away from the freight trains by a cop with a drawn gun. We were told we had to take a passenger and pay our way. So after 2 weeks' work, I got back to Revelstoke a cripple with $6. The whole gang was herded like slaves. The boss called us all the filthiest and worst names, degraded names, that under any other circumstances, no red-blooded man would put up with. Some were actually kicked while at work by the boss. This is the worst I've ever seen in 6 years in Canada and most all my life in England. Where is such treatment leading us all? So, really poignant letter. And then we get this letter or this note in the newspaper looking for clothes, shoes, and socks. The chief of police done. And that was city police. The city had Revelstoke had city police until 1932, and then we had provincial. So they're asking for donations. And he said many of these men are without socks and possess only the remnants of boots or shoes. Many could use other cast-off clothing to advantage. This is the chief of police. He was the chief here for 10 years in 1922 to 1932. In June of 1931, a delegation consisting of 2 local ministers and the school superintendent spoke to the Board of Trade about establishing a central feeding plan for transients. They suggested a soup kitchen set up near the tracks or meal tickets to give people to go to local restaurants. Mayor Needham stated that the city was feeding large numbers at the jail at a cost of 7 cents per meal, with recipients required to cook their own meals. They said that city finances would not allow for any greater effort than that. Said the city had allocated $60,000 for its own unemployed, and he believed it would be unwise to encourage the outsiders to expect relief here. Several speakers pointed out that the citizens were already giving relief to the outsiders from their back doors and believed that a soup kitchen would be a better solution than feeding floaters at the police station. But when they did come up with a plan in June of 1931, they did decide to continue to do it from the police station, which was at the corner of 3rd and Boyle, where the Parks Canada office is now standing. So at there was a meeting with the City Council, the Board of Trade, representatives from the churches, the Rotary Club, and they decided they would have regular hours available for transients to get meals at the police station. They would consist of porridge, bread, butter, milk, and mulligan stew. The plan would come into effect on July 1st and run for 1 month, with the expectation that the federal government, who were responsible for looking after the transient population, would have a plan in place by then. The city did not want to set up shelters. They wanted the transients to keep moving. That was specifically said in the article. And they were asking the public not to feed transients at their back doors, which a lot of families had been doing, but to refer them to the police station. Chief Constable Dunn stated that for the month of June 1931, 360 men had been fed at the police station, with a record of 45 in one day. He said that there were 3 groups of transients. Boys in their late teens or early 20s, who they said should be back at home, professional beggars and tramps, and men who were honestly striving to obtain work. He thought that Dunn stated that he thought that the municipality was being made a scapegoat, and that the province and the Dominion government were offloading their responsibilities onto municipalities. And he really thought that the RCMP and the provincial police should put a stop to boxcar travel. And of course, you know, there was CPR police too that were trying to keep people off, but the numbers were so great, it was hard to stop it. So people were, unemployed men were coming into Revelstoke looking for work on the CPR and on the Big Bend Highway, but they were trying to keep construction jobs to locals. But by the middle of June, the provincial government was establishing relief work camps, and they included the Big Bend work in those relief measures. By July 31st, 1931, there were 160 men working on the road. It was noted that unemployed men were urged to register at the courthouse, city hall, or police station, and they had to have been in BC for 1 year. The relief work was paying $2 per day for general labor, plus 80 cents per day to dependent families. The rates went up to over $5 for foremen and skilled trades. By mid-October 1931, there were close to 1,000 men working on road, 600 of them on the provincial side from the Bodencampment side. 17 camps were open or soon to open. By November 6th, the road work had shut down for throughout the province, as the Dominion government curtailed the appropriation for unemployment relief in BC. The locals came down from camps, and a lot of the non-locals remained in the camps. The newspaper said, it is understood that the shutting down of the work is only temporary, and that it will result in the weeding out of men who are not altogether destitute. Those registering could not have private means, even if they were also unemployed. In the middle of December, it was announced that relief work would continue, but on a reduced scale. And the Big Bend was approved for the work relief camps. So at the end of December 1931, the newspaper said, now at the end of 1931, it has been discovered that conditions have been very bad, and everyone is not quite so certain that better times are immediately ahead. Probably in 1932, the world will tread wearily the path to better times, having regard to the lessons it has learned in the last decade or so. There was also a note in the Revelstoke Review in the middle of December saying that 59 people attended a meeting for the unemployed at Smythe Hall. Said a petition signed by 143 locally unemployed people requested for the government to immediately consider providing the same relief to unemployed citizens as they were providing to unemployed non-citizens. So there was some resentment about, the transients, people who were coming in from other provinces. So in January of 1932, Ottawa approved $180,000 for the Big Bend Road construction. And but they didn't actually start work until mid-June of that year. And the provincial camps were reopened then. And under the provincial employment scheme, men were paid $7.50 per month. And they were housed and fed with that. But that meant in effect that only single men could work in the camps, as there was no money to provide for families. By the later in 1932, the Department of National Defense proposed that it put all of the work relief camps under the National Defense umbrella, and they would house homeless and unemployed men. It was actually even stated that economically the aim was to construct a series of public works at minimum cost, which, though necessary for the development of the country, could not otherwise have been put in hand for a number of years. So they actually kind of admitted that they were going to be underpaying people to get public works projects done. That was under Prime Minister R.B. Bennett, who wasn't terribly popular with the unemployed men of the country. They started off with a trial run in some federal projects in the East. In November of 1932, the Revelstoke Review in an editorial stated, "The Dominion, it is now known, will take over the feeding and shelter of homeless single men in urban centers, placing these in existing provincial camps and providing work where possible. The task of removing single homeless men from cities to camp is now being worked out by the new Provincial Relief Board. In respect to married and other men supporting families, it is announced that Ottawa will retain the same system as in last year, paying 1/3 of these costs in cities and other municipalities and 1/2 in unorganized districts." And again, with Christmas coming up, the Christmas Cheer Committee says finds itself confronted with a task of considerable magnitude, owing to the fact that a large number of the residents of this district will find this winter season to be a difficult one. And that year they raised $1,379 for the Christmas Cheer Fund. And the newspaper said, "For the 4th time, we come to the end of the calendar year with signs of depression around us. While we may see signs of better times, most of us are not so bold to express our optimistic opinions as we were 4 or even 2 years ago. Last year, we had learned to be a little cautious. Revelstoke had undoubtedly fared better in 1932 than it did in 1931. The Canadian Pacific Railway, which invariably determines the condition of the times in this important railway centre, has had a busy fall and summer in the handling of fruit and wheat. During recent months, men have been working who had not done so since the start of the Depression. There have been disappointments in other directions. The Big Bend Road, which was to have been finished in 1932, still languishes in a state of semi-completion. The city of Revelstoke has closed a very successful year. After 4 years of depression, the city is not asking for a receiver, nor are its bondholders. We do not feel that anyone in Revelstoke should look forward to the new year feeling that the worst is yet to come. There have been unmistakable signs of improvements in 1932, and we firmly believe that they will continue throughout the new year. And if it does, times in Revelstoke should be more than tolerable." And things were starting to improve slightly certainly over the worst year of 1931. And the city was able to access some funds for local relief projects, including the replacing of the storm sewer on Pearson Street. And said, according to the relief arrangements as they affect the municipalities, married men are permitted to obtain food to the extent of $17. This indebtedness is wiped out by such work as is underway for the present time. So they were basically working for food. So the men are willing and anxious to work this off. At Three Valley and Taft, several relief camps are located. The single men who live there at the expense of the government are given food and accommodation. But no matter how anxious they may be to retain their self-respect by giving labor in return, there is no arrangement by which they may do so. So at that point, they didn't have any work projects on in the Three Valley area. And of course, people were suggesting that there was certainly work to be doing, including said, we would like to say that the rock bluffs along Three Valley Lake were still there last fall, and unless an earthquake has moved them since, a little work widening the road alongside of them would still be of some good to the motoring public. And you can imagine what Three Valley Gap Road would have been like, or Three Valley Road would have been like back then. So it said here are two systems of relief in effect within a few miles of each other. Why should they be so far apart in principle? And then there was also concern that men were applying for relief when they had money in the bank, and that was not allowed. If you had any means at all, you could not apply for relief. So there was actually a man living at Mount Cartier who was charged with obtaining relief while he still had money in the bank, but the case was dismissed on a technicality. It looks like a reporter went up to one of the camps in September of 1933 and gave a report on the camps. Is that there were camps at that time at 10 Mile, 12 Mile, and 15 Mile with about 130 men in total, with another camp to be opened at 21 Mile. It says an inspection of the various camps shows that the men are being well cared for. And although they are suffering with the whole country through lack of regular employment at fair wages, nevertheless, they appear to be fairly well satisfied. They have made themselves comfortable through various devices. Hot and cold shower baths have been installed. Ventilation in camps is much better than formerly obtained. Hospital and first aid camps are well equipped with frequent medical inspection. Above all, rigid cleanliness of surroundings is required, with personal cleanliness as a natural result. All cabins are scrubbed out 3 times weekly and disinfected. Sleeping accommodation has been reduced in all cabins so that healthier conditions might prevail. And it said that the author of the article said it was my good fortune to arrive unexpectedly at mealtime and thus partake of the same fare at the same table with the men in camp. The food was found to be wholesome and plentiful, lacking only in some of the unnecessary frills of a metropolitan eating place. The conditions in the various cookhouses were found to be splendid, cleanliness in every particular being evident. And it said that no semblance of military discipline is in evidence on the work. On the other hand, freedom of action and individual initiative is encouraged. All men on going into camp are furnished ample bedding supplies, outer and inner garments, gloves, caps, boots, socks, mirrors, safety razors, and other minor incidentals. And then they were also noting that they could use games and puzzles and books. So they were asking for donations for that. They also noted that the camps were civilian and that no military discipline or military training was used in the camps. And that was different from the American camps, which were run on more of a military basis. But the National Defense Unemployment Relief Scheme was criticized by the Labour Congress of Canada, as well as other Labour councils. They claimed that the plan is serving not only to reduce the standard of living of the worker, but is particularly unfair to the married tradesmen without work, in that the erection of buildings, etc., by the single men on relief takes work away from the married men with families who were formerly employed on this type of construction work. So there was definitely some unrest that was starting to happen. On There was a sad incident in at the 10-mile camp on August 26, 1934, when 5 men were drowned in the Columbia River. There was suspension cable over the river, and they had attached the basket to it. It was the Forestry Department suspension cable, and it had been dismantled and disused for several years. But the men thought that it would be a fun thing to do, to set up this cable and go for rides across the river. But unfortunately, while they were in the cable, the cable broke with 6 men in the basket. And one of them was able to swim to shore, but the other 5 were drowned, and their bodies were not found. Their names were H. Kagan of Montreal, Joe Wall of Saskatchewan, R.W. Coquette of Vancouver, G. Bailey of Winnipeg, and E.C. McDonald of New Brunswick. And actually was contacted by a family of Joe Wall a couple of years ago, and they'd heard that he'd had an accident, but they didn't know the details, so I was able to share the information with them about what had happened. At that time, there were about 100 men living in the camp at 10 Mile. The National Defense Relief Camp organized a memorial service for the 5 men that drowned, as well as a large 7-foot wooden cross that was hewn out of timber at the spot and would be attached with along with a large 2.5-foot wreath and floral sprays. The newspaper said that if there were local residents who wished to attain the memorial, they could do so, but they were required to have a pass from the local office of the National Defense Department. And then another sad event at camp at Clanwilliam, west of Revelstoke. That camp had been in place for a few years. There's a picture of it in 1934. And in the end of January 1935, it was a really heavy snow year. There were slides all over the place. And you can see it's kind of in an avalanche path there. So a slide came down and killed 3 men. It demolished several of the buildings that you can see in this photograph. But George Boyd, the foreman, died, along with Jean-Edouard Cyr, and who was an assistant foreman, and a man named Joe Dunville. The slide continued onto the railway tracks nearby. You can see how it's covered the buildings there. And the 3 men who died were in the office building, which was completely destroyed by the slide. George Boyd was 56 years old at the time of his death, and he had a ranch near Sidmouth, but he had taken on this job as foreman at the camp. The National Defense officials couldn't get out immediately as the rotary on its way from Revelstoke to Albert Canyon encountered several slides, particularly at Loretta and at 13th Crossing, about 5 miles east. So it was such a bad snow year and bad avalanche year that it was hard. It took them a while for them to get this one cleared. Another picture showing the slide. So in the government was really being criticized for their choosing to establish the camps instead of creating a program of reasonable work and wages. And the discontent was really growing, especially in Vancouver. And the people in Vancouver were demanding better living conditions in the camps and new works programs from Ottawa that would actually pay decent wages. So they came up with a plan called the On to Ottawa Trek, where they would go across the country on boxcars and go to Ottawa and talk to R.B. Bennett and explain to him why it was a bad idea. So the trek actually passed through Revelstoke in early June of 1935. The newspaper said on Wednesday evening, over 800 of the relief camp strikers from Vancouver passed through the city on the seaboard freight. Their destination was, as a long streamer on the side of one of the boxcars indicated, on to Ottawa, where they intend laying their alleged claims for just treatment before Premier Bennett. About 10 extra provincial policemen were in town to handle the large crowd, in the event of disturbances arising while the train made its necessary stop here of about an hour. The men were very orderly, except for considerable cheering as they arrived and departed. Most of them patronized the local restaurants. Several hundred citizens were at the railway crossing on Mackenzie Avenue to witness the arrival of the train, as well as its departure at midnight. The sight of hundreds of men perched atop the boxcars was unusual, to say the least. The strikers actually did have a lot of support across the country. When they got to Golden, there's seen stories that there was women there who'd set up sort of tables, and they had big wash basins full of stews that they were cooking for the men, and bacon and food for them. And they did have other support as they got across the country. But after they left Revelstoke, there was a letter to the editor in the next edition from the organizers of the trek, and they'd sent $5 because some of the men who had been here had taken some things from the restaurants that they'd stopped in, including 11 water glasses, 24 cups, 4 salt shakers, and spoons that had been stolen out of the Canadian Cafe by some of the strikers. And the organizers did not want them to be seen as thieves and hooligans, so they actually sent money to cover the cost of the items that had been stolen. So when the strikers reached Regina, and of course there's a lot of information on the strikes, and I'm just going to be glossing over it a little bit, but there's a lot of information available online if you want to read more about the On to Ottawa trek and the Regina riot. So some of the men had gone to Ottawa to talk to Bennett, but he was intransigent. They were both basically just yelling at each other. So by the time that the organizers got back to Regina, the government had managed to have amassed quite a few police officers, and they were just determined that the men were going to leave, and it created a riot. A lot of people felt that the police were heavy-handed and that it shouldn't have happened in that way. But the result of it, one policeman was killed and dozens of men were injured and 130 were arrested. So they were trying to get the men back. So the Premier of Saskatchewan, Gardner, told the Prime Minister that the men should be fed where they are and sent back to camp and homes as they request, and stated that his government was prepared to undertake this work of disbanding the men. So they finally negotiated, and most of the men went back to Vancouver. But as a result of that, within the year, the National Defense Program Relief Program was disbanded. Almost right away, they stopped running the defense camps on the Big Bend project, and they turned it over to the Parks Board. And at that time, the Parks Board was running the camps and was continuing to manage the work. And things did get a little bit better then in terms of the pay. Men were then paid 45 cents per hour, and they did have to pay 25 cents per meal, but it still averaged out to about $3 a day plus board for all working days. And preference was being given to married ex-servicemen and civilians with dependents. So they weren't running it really as relief camps any longer. It was actually work camps where they were really focusing on the work and paying the men a proper wage. The Big Bend Highway construction continued then with mostly locally hired labor. The road wasn't completed until June of 1940. And it was really affected badly by the Depression, getting the work done, getting the money to do it. But there was once the war was declared, there was a final push to get the highway completed for need for the highway links for military convoys. So during the Depression, one of the bright spots in the later years was the filming of the movie called The Silent Barrier, which was also known as The Great Barrier, by the Gaumont British Picture Corporation. It was based on a book called Track of Destiny by Alan Sullivan, which is a highly fictionalized account of the discovery of Rogers Pass and the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was complete with forest fires, riots, horse chases, train wrecks, drowning, a prostitute with a heart of gold, and of course, a love story. It's a very, very cheesy movie, but there's some really nice local shots in it because this was the spur line on Campbell Avenue, and they'd set it up as their part of their movie set. The leading man was Richard Arlen, who was kind of a B movie actor, and had over his career he appeared in 148 movies and several TV shows. So you can see where they built the sets are along Campbell Avenue between 2nd and 3rd. They turned the old C.B. Hume warehouse into the Rat Trap Saloon, and also created a Moodyville station at Three Valley Lake. They also filmed some scenes on the Big Bend Highway, Silvertip Falls, Montana Slough, south of town, Arrowhead, Mount Revelstoke National Park, Glacier, Golden, and Lake Louise. One of my favorite scenes is a chase scene where they're trying to catch the train before it goes into a slough. And in the course of the chase, they're on top of Mount Revelstoke, they're at Golden, they're south of town, they're east of town, they're west of town, all in this one chase sequence. So you can see the alpine, the alpine trees in some of the scenes, and then the lake and other ones. It's quite funny. But the good thing is that it created, it gives people something really fun to do in the community. And they hired a lot of extras, and they were actually paying the extras $3.50 a day. They were asked to arrive in working clothes and with old-fashioned hats, if possible. And they used local labor and material, which really helped the local economy. There was a couple of local women, Kay Harwood and Dorothea Lundell, who were added to the local office staff as stenographers on script work. The movie premiered at the Province Theatre, which is the Ken Magnus building on where the TELUS store is right now, in April of 1937. In September 1936, it was noted, from the financial aspect of the stay of the picture people here, it can be said that it has been of untold value to scores of local men and women, assistant technicians, carpenters, secretaries, and extras, many of whom earned good wages while engaged by the picture company. The business people of the town also came in for good trade as a result of the stay here of the picture people. Tourists flocked to town in more than usual numbers as well to have a peep at movies in the making, and these also left a few shekels in town. And then the 1937 December 31st editorial said that there was much to be thankful for. This picture was actually taken after 1937 because the City Hall is there. But the editorial said, the people of Revelstoke during 1937 have had much to be thankful for. It must be agreed that conditions generally have been much more profitable for almost every resident of the district. Employment throughout the district has been definitely on the upgrade. Most of this, of course, being due to the work on the Big Bend section of the Trans-Canada Highway. And they mentioned that there was other work in the region, timbering, mining, and railway expenditures, and pole cutting. There was up the Big Bend, and a lot of men had been able to find work. Mining in the Lardo had played a major role, giving employment to scores of men. The new True Fisher mine at Ferguson and the Silver Cup mine had both been operating. And then there was an expected increase in tourism once the Big Bend Highway was completed. So in the following year, December of 1938, really looked like Revelstoke was back on the upswing. They noticed that growth in the building has been steady and solid, and they referred to the depression as being the late depression. So really in terms of Revelstoke's economy, it had really bounced back. So building progress, which lagged for a number of years, received a strong shove forward during the last 2 years, with a number of major improvements. The Big Bend Highway and a modern up-to-date garage on the corner of Campbell Avenue and First Street, a new block by Mrs. Paula Overhill, her beauty salon, which was where the Remax building is, corner of Campbell and First. And the Hume building had been updated. The new Avonlea Theatre was built in it was opened in December of 1938. Now the Roxy, of course. The Regent Hotel had a lot of updates and additions. And there were improvements to the King Edward Hotel. And the construction of the Revelstoke United Church in 1937. And a couple of new tourist camps, including the Elliott's Tourist Camp, which is where Mountain View Motel is on First Street West. So really the end of the Depression era ended with the beginning of World War II. Just prior to that, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited Revelstoke. And that was just a huge lift for everybody. There was concern about the upcoming war, but the royal visit just made people feel, patriotic. It made them feel hopeful. There were probably 9,000 people who were here, which is about double the local population that came for the royal visit. People were coming from all over the Okanagan and the South Country to see the King and Queen. And so that was really the end of that, what we call the dirty 30s. And I think any of us who might have grown up with parents who were brought up in the Depression, you realize what an impact it had on that generation. I had a mother, my mom was born in 1920 and they grew up in Manitoba. She was one of 10 children and she never wasted anything. I wasn't allowed to throw out anything at all. Like little bits of soap, when they got too small, you'd put them in a mesh bag and keep using them till they were completely gone. So it certainly, raised a different generation of people who really knew how to conserve. So thank you for joining us for this talk. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the Tournament of Champions. Thanks again for coming.
Yeah.